The grease under a Henschel mechanic's fingernails in April 1945 was different from the grease of 1940. It was grittier. It's mixed with the pulverized brick of a collapsing Ruhr valley and the desperate salt of sweat that knew no rest. By the time the final signatures were pressed into parchment in a schoolhouse in Reims and a villa in Karlshorst, the German war machine hadn't just stopped. It had been grinding its own gears into fine metallic dust for months. There is a persistent myth that a coherent nation-state simply reached a point of tactical impossibility and laid down its arms in a singular, somber moment of realization. The reality was far more fractured, a slow-motion shattering of an industrial spine that left millions of men holding rifles with no bullets and driving tanks with dry sumps, waiting for a word from Berlin that had already been swallowed by the smoke of Soviet Katyushas. To understand the end, one has to look at the horses. We often see the panzer divisions in grainy black and white, the sleek lines of the panther or the terrifying bulk of the tiger. But by the winter of 1944, the Wehrmacht was a medieval army with a few high-tech ornaments. When the fuel ran out, the horses died in the mud of the Vistula. When the horses died, the men pulled the carts. The men collapsed. The equipment was simply left to rust where it sat. The collapse of the German military was not a decision made by the high command. It was a physical law of thermodynamics. You cannot run a 1,000-mile front on synthetic fuel that no longer exists because the Romanian oil fields are a sea of fire and the Luna plants are twisted skeletons of steel. In the final weeks, the concept of a front line became a polite fiction maintained by generals looking at maps and bunkers, while the actual soldiers experienced a surreal, disjointed reality. A sergeant in the 12th Army might be engaged in a fierce firefight over a single bridgehead while 3 miles to his left, an entire company was trading their Lugers for American cigarettes and chocolate. The war didn't end with a bang or a whimper so much as it dissolved into 1,000 local truces and desperate flights westward. The terror of the East was the great engine of the surrender. Men who had spent years fighting with a cold, professional brutality suddenly found a frantic, kinetic energy not to defeat the enemy but to choose which enemy would capture them. The race to the Elbe was a marathon of the damned, with Tiger tanks abandoned on the Autobahn not because they were knocked out, but because the fuel needles had flicked to zero and stayed there. Inside Berlin, the air tasted of cordite and old masonry. The city had been turned into a geographic lung, heaving with the weight of incoming shells. Civilians living in the U-Bahn tunnels weren't thinking about the sovereignty of the Reich. They were thinking about the smell of the damp concrete and the terrifying vibration of the S-Bahn tracks overhead. When the end came for them, it didn't come with a pen. It came with a Red Army soldier stepping into a cellar with a flashlight and a submachine gun. The surrender was already written in the soot on the faces of the Trümmerfrauen, the rebel women who were already beginning the impossible task of stacking bricks while the smoke was still rising from the chancellery. The signatures in Reims on May 7th were merely a bureaucratic acknowledgement of a corpse that had been cooling for weeks. Alfred Jodl sat there in his stiff collar, a man who had spent the war translating madness into military orders, and signed a document that effectively deleted the organization he had served. It was a sterile room, devoid of the Wagnerian drama. The regime had promised for its twilight. There were no flaming pyres for the officer corps, just the scratch of a fountain pen and the quiet ticking of a clock. The Americans and British wanted it done quickly. They wanted the logistics of peace to begin because the logistics of war had become an unmanageable nightmare of millions of displaced persons, starving prisoners, and shattered infrastructure. But the Soviets demanded their own theater. For Stalin, the surrender at Reims was a Western insult, a way to sideline the people who had bled the most to reach the heart of the beast. So, they did it again in Berlin on May 8th. Wilhelm Keitel arrived with his field marshal's baton, trying to maintain a shred of Prussian dignity in a city that had been reduced to a lunar landscape. He looked at the French representative in the room and reportedly sneered, wondering how the people they had crushed in 6 weeks in 1940 were now sitting at the table of victors. It was a moment of peak irony, the man who had signed the criminal orders. For the invasion of the East was now complaining about the seating arrangements when Keitel signed. He wasn't ending a war so much as he was officiating a funeral for a world that had already vanished. Outside that room, the ends were happening in a million different ways. For a U-boat crew in the North Atlantic, the end was a burst of static over the radio, and the bitter, terrifying task of hoisting a black flag and sailing toward a British port, wondering if they would be lynched or fed. For a teenager in the Hitler Youth, standing in a trench in a coat 3 sizes too big, the end was the realization that the wonder weapons were never coming, and that the man he had been told was a god had died in a hole in the ground like a cornered animal. The papers signed in May 1945 are often treated as the final period at the end of a long, dark sentence. But for the person on the ground, the transition from war to not war was a blurry, violent smudge. In the East, the fighting didn't stop when the ink dried. Pockets of resistance, or simply groups of men too terrified to stop moving, continued. To trade lead with the Red Army well into the middle of the month, the machinery of the state had evaporated. There were no banks, no postal services, no police, no food distribution networks. There was only the stunned null, 0 hour. We think of surrender as an act of will, but for Germany in 1945, it was an act of exhaustion. The factories had been hammered into silence by the 8th Air Force and the RAF, their roofs open too. The sky like rib cages, the railway system, once the pride of German engineering, was a tangled mess of scorched sleepers and overturned locomotives. You cannot fight a war when you cannot move a crate of ammunition from point A to point B without a Mustang diving out of the sun to turn your truck into a pyre. The German soldier didn't stop fighting because he lost his nerve. He stopped because the physical world stopped providing him with the means to continue. The surrender was a legal necessity for the Allies. A way to ensure there would be no stab-in-the-back myth this time, no claim that the army remained undefeated in the field. They wanted the signatures. They wanted the film of the high-ranking generals bowing their heads. But the real surrender had happened in the stomachs of the soldiers who hadn't eaten in 4 days, and in the eyes of the mothers who watched the T-34s roll past their windows. The signing of the papers was just the world catching up to the facts on the ground. As the sun set over a ruined Europe in those weeks of May, the silence was perhaps the most jarring thing of all. For 6 years the continent had been defined by the mechanical scream of engines and the rhythmic thud of explosions. When that stopped, the vacuum was filled by the sound of millions of boots shuffling toward prisoner of war camps and the quiet sobbing of a population realizing the scale of the void they had created. The documents in the archives, with their elegant signatures and official seals, suggest a clean break. But history isn't clean. It is the smell of the Henschel mechanic's grease, the cold metal of a discarded helmet in a ditch, and the long, slow realization that while the papers were signed in an afternoon, the war would take a lifetime to truly end.